All right, Marty Jourard here with Stephen K. Peeples, and we're going to talk about Motels' early history. And so the group actually formed in the San Francisco Bay Area. Martha Davis was the kingpin. And Marty, can you kind of give us a capsule history of the motels up in the Bay Area and then how they landed in Southern California?
Sure. Now, when Martha first started playing in bands up there, I was in my senior year in high school in Gainesville, Florida, and she was in Berkeley, California. So that's how it started, long before I met her. Martha had a band called the Warfield Foxes in Berkeley. She grew up in Berkeley. And among the members of that band was Dean Chamberlain, the guitar player. And Dean came down with her and these other members in 1975 to LA to try to get a record deal. And they changed their name to the Angels of Mercy, which was probably an improvement. But on the way to this show they were playing at Barney's Beanery, of all places, Martha said, "I don't want to play the Beanery called the Angels of Mercy. We got to come up with a name." And her and Dean Chamberlain, the guitarist, happened to be driving down Santa Monica Boulevard on the way to Barney's, because Barney's was on Santa Monica Boulevard, where all of these motels were on the street, not high class ones, but many of them, neon signs. And Dean said, "Hey, why not name the band the Motels? We will already have our name in lights everywhere." So they named it the Motels. And now I have no involvement at this time. I'm just off being me somewhere else. They recorded in '76 a demo for Warner Brothers that didn't get them a record deal. Then in 1977, and at this time I was in LA, but I hadn't met any of them, they were in negotiations with Capitol Records to sign to Capitol. And the day before they were going to sign with Capitol, the drummer quit. I don't know why, but that's what happened. And the band dissolved in June of '77. And at this point, my brother Jeff, who had seen some version of that band, had decided when he turned 30, and he had just been ushered out of Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers before their first album came out. He'd done some work with them. He said, "I've turned 30 and I want to join a band. I like the Motels. I'm going to go join the Motels." And he asked around, and there was no Motels. There was just this woman, Martha Davis, he knew of. And he had to track her down. And when he met Martha, she said, "Yeah, everybody says they'll want to join my band once I form it. They'll come in, but they don't want to help me form it. Here I am with my songs." Jeff started working with her for about 6 months. And I had no involvement in that. Working on her songs, arranging them. He was very organizational, my brother, older brother, Jeff. And I have in my diary here, it says May 1978. Jeff and Martha Motel at Mask, which means that I met Martha, but I just called her Martha Motel. I wasn't playing with them at the time.
At the Mask, which was a premier early fabulous LA punk venue.
The Mask was in the basement of a building that held the Pussycat Theater. It was an adult theater at the corner of Cherokee and Hollywood Boulevard.
Right.
And in the back alley, down these nasty concrete steps, was a basement that this guy, Brendan Mullen from Scotland, had organized into a rehearsal place. And he divided up these spaces to rent to bands with really pitiful plywood partitions that didn't even go up to the ceiling. So if you were rehearsing here, the band over here and over here, that we could all hear each other. And these bands were like the Screamers, I've said some band, Cruzados, these bands that were just punky.
Yeah.
And at one point, Martha was taking plaster and trying to seal up the space between the top of the wall and the ceiling. So they were going about their business, and I was basically hanging out at the beach with my girlfriend and having these pretty bad jobs. I won't go through the jobs I had, but I was a guy in LA and I was working these jobs, 40-hour jobs. Jeff said, "I want you to come down and play saxophone on this song. I want you to play ba ba da." It's a song called "Dressing Up." I said, I can probably do that. 3 notes, I got it. So he had me come down, and I heard Martha sing finally, and I heard her sing, and I said, wow, she's got the most beautiful voice. I mean, this sounds great. And I like the songs. And in the corner of this rehearsal space was a polymoog that Martha owned. She didn't know how to play it, but there it was. It's an early synthesizer. And they said, can you play a synthesizer? I said, yeah, I can play a keyboard. I've never played a synth. So I was playing like a piano for a while because I could play piano sort of. And I oozed into the band very casually and sidewaysy. And the band lineup at that time was coming and going. You know, there's history. You can look up for that. But drummers came and went and so on. The interesting thing about that space is we split it with the Go-Go's. The Go-Go's in the Motels had this little, must have been 10 by 14 foot space. And the Go-Go's would come in after they graduated high school. They would come in after their jobs and start rehearsing at about 10 until about 12 midnight. And then we would come in around midnight and rehearse till about 2:30 in the morning. And we had our amps set up. Their amps were on one side, ours were on the other, but the mics were in the middle. And my brother Jeff said, how come the PA is, you can't hear the singing anymore after a few weeks of us working with the Go-Go's? The Go-Go's wore so much lipstick that, and when they sung, they just had globbed up the front of the mic, so they were completely clogged. And we suggested they start get some foam covers for them. And Jane Weedland, who at the time was calling herself Jane Drano, was wearing Dayglow lipstick. And so they figured that out. And it was quite amusing looking back that we were rehearsing with the Go-Go's. And when we got signed to Capitol, they moved their amps to our side of the room, thinking it was the lucky side of the room. And of course, I don't have to tell you what happened with the career of the Go-Go's.
Yeah, yeah. That's a whole other movie.
Yeah.
So to speak. So, well, let me ask you real quickly. I mean, you and Marty grew up in Gainesville. How did he wind up in California? Just because he heard about Martha and the Motels and decided that he wanted to migrate to the West and join the band? Was it that? And then you followed him, and because he was kind of the advance man for the trip west?
No. First of all,
okay.
I'm Marty. You meant to ask, what about Jeff?
I'm sorry, Jeff.
Jeff is my older brother.
Edit.
Yeah.
Friday.
Okay, so Jeff, my older brother, who worked with Martha to create the Motels that got signed to Capitol, had moved out to LA separately because he had a long career with this other band called RGF, and then they broke up in Florida, and this guy that sung with them, who was from Boston, called Larry Thetford, he moved out to LA, and Jeff was out there playing with him, and that broke up, and there was Jeff just hanging out in LA with his girlfriend, who happened to be Stan Lynch's sister. Stan Lynch was a drummer, Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. There's a whole Gainesville story of everybody coming out, many musicians coming out to LA. So Jeff hooked up with Martha because he wanted to play with Martha, and there was no band, as I was mentioning before. But he came out in about 74, and I came out in 76 separately. I came out to go to USC, and I went there for a semester. But my secret plan was to come out like all my other musical friends from Gainesville, Florida, out to Los Angeles and try to get in a band and get a record deal.
Right.
And a surprising number of us did. But there was no connection between me and Jeff musically until the Martha Davis situation began to develop. And he said, I know a guy that can play sax and keyboard, my brother, because of course he did. We grew up together.
How convenient.
Yeah.
Well, so it was you and Jeff and Martha, and an ever-changing rhythm section, or when did it finally kind of crystallize? At what point did you guys lock into the classic lineup that recorded the first album, that got signed and recorded the first album?
It was late in 78. The first gig I played as a Motel, I didn't actually play. We went up to Martha was going to have a triumphant return to Berkeley. So we went up there on August 25th, 78, which was my birthday. I was 24, to play some place called Ashkenaz Folk Dance Hall. And I didn't know anything about synthesizers. So this thing's set up, it's our first gig, and I go to play it and there's nothing coming out at all. I didn't know it even had a fuse, which had blown. So for the first Motel show, I sat and watched the Motels. I did not play that show. The next day we played a gig where I figured out it needed a fuse and I put it in and I played a gig. But the band drummers came and went, and bass players did, and various people that weren't very good musicians, but they said they knew Martha and they said, I'll play with you. And what happened is Musicians Contact Service had this guy, Michael Goodrow, who had listed himself. He was a bass player from Albuquerque, New Mexico. He was very good. And we auditioned, I had notes that said audition 20 drummers. I think I was exaggerating, but along came Brian Glasscock. Brian Glasscock is an English guy from Hatfield, England. And I don't know exactly why he ended up in LA, but he was in various bands. He was in a band called Toe Fat. Apparently he played drums on How Can You Mend a Broken Heart by the Bee Gees. And he was a solid drummer. He played on some Iggy album too. Oh. And once we got him, a really good drummer and a really good bass player, well, that's when a band can actually stand up and start running.
Right.
Without that, it ain't going to happen. And that was the synergy of having a good drummer and a bass player, and Martha's songs, and the cooperation that me and Jeff had. We were not competing. We were brothers, but we worked together, and we had separate instruments, and we'd grown up in the same place in the same music. We brought, I won't say Southern, but we grew up in the South, and whatever it is we brought, it was part of the recipe, just the music we listened to, and the fact that we really admired Martha's music. And we also listened to that first Cars album. My brother Jeff made me listen to the first Cars album 2 times in a row. Side 1, side 2, side 1, side 2. He said, I want the band to not sound like the Cars, but to approach arranging like the Cars and approach songs in that way.
Right, right.
Kind of thought of it as pop music with a twist, or twisted pop. It was definitely pop. There's a verse and a chorus and a bridge and so on, but it's different. The sounds are different. And we worked those songs out very carefully, bar by bar. If you listen to the first Motels album, we're not jamming. No.
Well, there was a period when the lineup solidified, and then there was the period of really intense club work that led up to being signed. What was that period like? And kind of describe the other bands that were on the same scene, and what was going on, so that we understand the context.
Yeah. I think the best way to understand it in terms of us getting signed, we were not a punk band. There's a lot of punk going on at the time, but we weren't punk. When the Knack got signed, they were an LA band, and they got signed and they made a record for almost nothing, and it sold millions, and they had a #1 single and a #1 album.
And they were not a punk band.
No, they were not. They were modeling themselves after the Beatles.
Right.
They wrote pop songs. At this point, LA record labels, who were usually looking outside of LA for acts, went, what about LA acts? And so this meant not only were they looking at these LA bands going, hey, this one LA band made a huge hit record for almost nothing, and they're from LA. They started sending A&R people all to these little clubs around town. And of course, once you know that and you're thinking of starting a band, then you're going to start a band, and it's feeding itself. So it truly was a really intense scene of little clubs. And these are not slick clubs. You couldn't play the Whiskey or the Roxy if you were just a street band. You needed a record deal to do that. So we played clubs we played Gazzari's, Club 88, the Troubadour, where you basically had to almost pay to play there.
Yep.
Those are the ones that came up, but mostly we played Madame Wong's. that was a restaurant turned into a music venue in Chinatown, and Esther Wong and George Wong owned it. And she was an intense woman. She loved Martha and the band. So we played there, I figured 34 times. I don't have it with me, but there was a calendar where, we played in March, which was 2 months before we got signed. You could have seen us, I think, 8 times in March. And at that point, A&R people were sniffing around, and they said, hey, you got to check out the Motels. Where are they playing? Well, they're playing 4 nights this week at Wong's. So these people started showing up. And at
You've
one
got
point,
a residency going on practically.
Pardon?
You got a residency going on practically.
It was as close to a residency as possible as you could have. And my brother pointed out the other day, and I didn't know this, that there would be times when a band would cancel, and Esther Wong would call up Jeff or Martha and say, can you play tonight? And that wasn't on the calendar because the band that was. So I think we played there more than I actually wrote down or had evidence of. And at one time, Martha went to the restroom between sets, and some woman came up to her and said, I have a label called White Noise Records. I want to sign the Motels for $500. And she said, hey, we got offered a record deal. But what happened is what I call a feeding frenzy with the record labels. I think it's a very small scene in the late 70s where they all knew what the other labels were trying to sign, and there was this competition. But the label that got interested first was Capitol, because they had already been interested in Martha a couple years before when they were about to sign, and Carter was involved with that. So they were interested first, which means they were really interested. But as word got around, and Robert Hilburn wrote a really great comment about us, and so did Don Snowden, really a great review that pumped up interest. Then Warner Brothers and various labels would show up and talk to us, and we took meetings with all of them, but we realized Capitol was really interested from the beginning. And we played all these shows, and by the time they wanted to sign us, we played so much, we were so greasy is the word I use. We could play. We had our set down, all the original songs. We had a few we threw in The Big Hurt, which is a Tony Fisher song. Yep. And we did a killer version of the theme from Route 66.
Oh, yes, you did. Yes,
and we did it note for note, and that was fun. When it came time to play in the studio, which none of us had done before, we were very ready to play, and we literally played a show on a Saturday at Wong's. We signed Sunday, which was Mother's Day, 1979, and then Monday we went to Sunset Sound and began recording, which essentially consisted of playing our live set until we got good takes. So it took about 9 months from when I joined, August of 78 to May of 79, to get signed. And that was remarkable, really. If you look at what was going on in LA at the time, it was electrifying. It was new wave.
But it was a very electrifying period because, as you mentioned, there were all these little clubs and multiple bands vying for audiences to try to build followings and get some traction and attract A&R guys and people like Bruce Ravid and Bruce Garfield from Capitol were out in the clubs all the time. I worked with Garfield in the PR department, and he moved up to A&R because he was a club rat. He wanted to be in the clubs all the time and help find and break new talent instead of publicize the existing ones. I give him that, but it was a very electric and exciting time.
Well, these times come along in the history of music. The Beatles, it happened. There was a big scene for a while in my hometown, and they feed on themselves, and they almost, they'll burn out, you could say. I mean, they have their arc, and we were in the right place at the right time with the right material, and the right people surrounded Martha finally, where the quality of her songwriting and performing was matched certainly enhanced by her support group. And it took a long time for her to attract those people. I have to mention Wong's again, because it was kind of like the Cavern in Liverpool, maybe.
Right.
It's a bit of a stretch. But I went in there once, and I'd grown up in the South, and these clubs you go to, there would be fights, and it would just be like yo-ho, just, it wasn't really about music. It was something else. I went to Wong's one night, and the Knack were playing, and I don't think they were signed yet. And I went in there, and they sounded great. They were very slick. In fact, they played Heartbeat by Buddy Holly, and I'd never even heard that song. I thought they wrote it.
Wow.
And I'm looking around at the audience, and everybody's well dressed, and they got skinny ties, and they're trying to look sharp, and nobody's screwing around with anybody. They're listening to the music, and the band's all wearing ties and trying to be the Beatles. And I looked around and went, if this is new wave, I'm in. This felt right. And this is a picture of this is us playing Wong's. If you look back there, those are dried palmetto fronds. They had some kind of some kind of dance review that was like from the Philippines.
Yeah, a tropical tiki thing.
It was a tiki stage. I thought if anybody ever put those on fire, we're all going to die.
Yeah.
There's only one staircase down, and I'm playing this Polly Moog because that's all I had. And there's Martha being Martha.
Nice.
And I know I talked to you last week about making Little Robbers, which was 1983.
Right.
And what that was like. I won't repeat myself, but I just want to point out that this is in the basement. This is the Mask. This is what the band was that got signed to Capitol. It's Martha, it's me. Well, there we are. And that was what we were when we were signed. We were not a slick, put together band. We were not session players. We weren't. It was, when I say we were from the streets, that was below the streets, the Mask.
Yeah. Yeah, that was subterranean for sure.
Yeah. And it was an exciting time. And these posters my brother Jeff would put up, he designed this. This was from this is 1979.
Mm-hmm.
After we rehearsed at about 2:30 in the morning at the Mask, we would split up the Hollywood area and say, you put up posters on Cahuenga Pass area, I'll do Hollywood, you do that area. And it almost, not every time, but several times it would start raining at 2:30 in the morning when we started putting up the posters. And it hardly rained in Southern Cal, but it did when we put up the posters. And I certainly remember stapling along these posters to see us play at Wong's on all those giant palm trees that line Hollywood High School on Hollywood. Because every time I drove by them years later, when I used to staple posters to that.
Yeah, those staples are probably still in those trees too.
Yeah. And speaking of the Knack, they had this trick where all your posters were torn down because it's illegal to do it. But the Knack, either they did or had somebody do it. They would staple their posters on these telephone poles about 6 feet up. They must have had a stapler on a pole, and nobody could tear them down. So they'd be up there. I thought that's really clever.
Or they had a guy in a pickup truck with a big ladder in the back, and they just roll up to the pole and just tack them on. I've seen that happen. But yeah. Well, you said that the Knack success at Capitol kind of helped I won't say necessarily pave the way for the Motels, but it certainly kind of juiced Capitol and their entire operation into focusing on LA and LA bands and working the scene here, as opposed to sending out A&R people through, to the hinterlands, to other music centers like Nashville or New York or wherever. And so how did the Knack being signed to Capitol benefit you directly? Was there any direct benefit, or was it just because you guys were working in the same scene at the same time and on the same label with the same promotion people behind you?
It was just a random fact that the Knack were signed to Capitol and we got signed to Capitol. There's no benefit to the fact that the Knack were also on Capitol. What the Knack did was allow many bands in LA to get signed to a record deal because there were LA bands. There was a band called the Shoes and the Bottles and 2020. And I mean, I could
Actually,
go on.
the Shoes were from Chicago, but they came here.
They came. Yeah, I guess a lot of bands came. My point is, the Knack encouraged record labels in LA to sign bands and give them one shot at least. Like the Bottles, let's just say, and I don't even know their music, but the Bottles were signed, they put out one album and it didn't do anything and they were dropped. So what it did at the very least is give many more bands, the next signing gave many more bands the shot to put out one album. And if it stuck to the wall, as we say, you throw it to the wall in the industry. And if it worked, then they'd maybe make a second album. And if it didn't, that was it. We lucked out with Capitol because our first album didn't sell very well and our second album didn't sell very well. And that was rare to still be on a major label when that happened.
Was your original deal like a 5-album deal, or was it 2 albums and they'd re-up, or how did that? Yeah, because at the end of the second album's life and promotion, they had to kind of make a call, right?
Yeah, they had to make a call. It's one of those one-sided deals when you tell somebody, I just signed a 5-album deal with Capitol. All that means is that if everything goes great, they have the option to make you commit to 5 albums. They do not have a commitment to put out 5 albums. So we had a decent lawyer, a very good lawyer, Milt Olin.
Yes.
Great lawyer, great guy. He's passed away.
Yeah, it was a bike accident.
We had a standard record deal. We didn't have any history. We were a brand new band. But they stuck with us because the first album had a Total Control was a gold single in Australia. And the great thing about being on Capitol, now that I think about it, is that Capitol was really an arm of EMI.
Yeah.
EMI's American label. Now, I never understood that much, but because of that, EMI was a global, they released albums all around the world. So our albums came out in France and in Spain and Japan. And so if something didn't necessarily sell in America, maybe another country would like it. And that other country was Australia. Our first album went gold in Australia, and we had either number 1 or number 2 with Total Control as a single. So that was encouraging. Then our second album, we had the song Danger. That was I think it was a semi-hit in France. And so there were little clues that things might just work out. Also, we had an in-house songwriter, Martha Davis, and she was not running out of musical ideas, and that was certainly helpful. And they did stick with us. And as I told you the last time we talked, the third album had a non-commercial version and then a commercial version, which gave us a top 10 hit. And once you get a top 10 song, a label's pretty encouraged by that. And so
right. Apocalypso and All For One you're talking
right.
about.
And then it ran its course.
Right. Well, so looking back on that era now, and you and Martha are still out doing it after all this time. Is it still fun? We have a minute and a half left.
Yes, it's still fun. It's still fun because she's got very good musicians in the band that support her. The material is, I love every song. I mean, I like some songs more than others for personal reasons, but there's not one song that I go, oh no, I have to play this. The set list, I look at the set list, and it varies, of course, because we have many albums to choose from. I go, I like these songs. These are fun to play. They deliver to the audience. Plus, in many of these, I wrote the parts that I'm playing. I'm not playing somebody else's sax solos. It's me.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's still fun, and it really is about the music, as corny as that sounds. Musicians play, and this material is material that suits me, and the people in the band, and it also, part of me is in it already. So when we play it, it is amusing to me that I'm playing parts in 2023, and I'll be playing these at the end of the month, that I wrote with one hand in 1978 at the Mask. You know, some little keyboard part. It isn't even hard to play, but it's the right part.
It's
So,
the
yeah,
right,
it's real fun.
exactly. It's not a lot of notes. It's just the right note.
Yeah, it's not exhausting to play these.
Well, we're gonna be out of time in a second. I just want to say thank you so much for covering early Motels history. And next time we talk, let's talk about Gainesville and